This is Marina from Frocks Frolics with another chapter in the Bobby Dazzler sewing course. And in this chapter I'm going to show you how to sew the bib.
Grab the bib and place it on top of the front trouser. We're lining up the center front and the edges, and then we'll just fit it on. Sometimes it feels like you have a little bit too much bib there. That's because you have a curve and the rough edges of the bib are slightly longer because of the curve, but where you have the seam line, it's actually exactly right. We're also going to prepare the plackets for the front, so we're going to fold those lengthways in half and press that fold. And then we're going to serge one of the shorter edges of the placket, and I've done that here. And then we're attaching the placket to the bib lining. Make sure the fold faces inwards and the rough edge faces outwards. Flip over the placket and pin it to the bib. The right sides should be facing each other. Just make sure the rough edges face the outside. And now we're going to sew those pieces together. Again, it's a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Lock in your stitches. And then we do the same on the other side. Lock in your stitches again. Move over to the other side. I never cut the threads off in between. There's no need. You just move it along. And now we're also going to sew the bib to the front trouser. Here it's important that your left hand stays in charge of the fabric, so it kind of holds the fabric. The right hand removes the pins so that the edges stay on top of each other. The bib always wants to kind of move upwards a little bit because we have that curve, so you must not let it. So your left hand is in control of that fabric by holding it in place. I also make sure that nothing falls over underneath. Lock in your stitches. Now we're going to iron the seam allowance into the bib. First we iron the seam allowance flat. That's very important. It always makes every seam sit better when you do that. Remove any pins that you have put in there. The pins in this case I put in so nothing would fold over underneath it, the pockets and such. If you've fixed them already in with a holding stitch before, then fair enough, it probably won't do that anyway, but I put them in there just to be sure. Give that a very good press. Well ironed is half sewn, we used to say when I was a training apprentice. A lot of people like to skip ironing. Please iron every step really well, and then you have a beautiful product. Next we're going to cut back the seam allowance. Cutting the seam allowance back in stages. I'm cutting the bib back slightly shorter. And then the front trouser, I just trim a little bit from the top, and that makes sure that we have the best possible flat seam in there, because when we put the buttonhole in, especially on the side, it makes it easier, and anything that makes this buttonhole easier is welcome. Cut back the trouser pocket, corners and the center front seam allowance, and then I'm just folding it back and having a little feel, is there anything that's really still quite bulky? And I think that the pocket is a little bit bulky still, so I'm going in there and I'm cutting that back as well, and I'm doing that of course on both sides. That's nice and flat now. Super. Move out the other corner of that pocket. Yeah, that's much better. It's nice and flat now. I can iron my lining as well. And I'm also ironing up the seam allowance. Makes it easier to pin in a minute. Beautiful. Turn it over. And that looks good. Now we're going to sew the lining and the shell together. Right sides face each other, and we are starting at the waistline seam. We'll make sure that that lines up first, and then we pin the placket from the start of the placket to the front leg, and then all the way up and around. The one thing you may want to do if you have a lighter fabric is to use some iron-on interfacing here just in the area where we have the diagonal on either side of the bib going upwards. I did not do that here. I didn't do it on any of my dungarees I sewed up, and it wasn't necessary because it is a fairly firm denim. But if you use a lighter weight fabric, then you can put some stay tape in. I'm also going to snip the seam allowance here just to make it a little bit flatter on that seam we're going to sew in a minute. So we've got the waist seam facing into the bib and the seam here facing downwards, so that we don't have the two seams going the same way, which is 4 layers of fabric. Then we also want to mark where we're going to come out, where we have this little corner that shuts out, which we need for the closure. So you want to mark that with your tailor's chalk, that line. You can also mark the seam allowance if that's helpful. And we do that on the other side as well. Quick line really will suffice in that area. There we go. I've also marked the seam allowance. If that's helpful, you can do that. There's no need to though. And now we're going to sew around here. And where we have got the little corner, we're going to reduce the stitch length to 1.5 because we don't want this to rip out when we turn it again. Same as with the pocket, we have to cut right into that corner. So it makes sense to reduce the stitch length in that area to 1.5, and now I'm lengthening it again, and then I'm going all the way up and around. Make sure that my seam allowance is still facing down there from my lining, and from my shell fabric the seam allowance is facing up, and so I've got a really nice flat look. And make sure that you push the fabric more in, because we don't have the stay tape. Push it in rather than pulling on it. Never pull on it, so that when it's top stitched, that's completely firm and secure and doesn't need extra support of stay tape or iron-on interfacing or whatever you may want to use there. The needle in the fabric, turn again, put the presser foot back down, go down the other side. And again, you can see me slightly pushing the fabric in rather than just holding it. I hope that's visible, but if it's not, that's what you have to do. Now I want to put down the stitch length again to 1.5. All right, into the corner, hit that sweet spot, turn, and there you go. Done. Now we want to cut into that corner. Don't be scared, same as with a pocket, we cut right to the quick there. And then we get that beautiful little corner that just juts out and will facilitate our closure. Do the same on the other side, cut right to the stitch line. And then we can turn this. Before we do, we want to cut a little bit more seam allowance back. So we're doing that on the placket here. I mean, I did mean well with my cutting back, and I still had trouble with a buttonhole, but more of that in the chapter for the buttonhole. To get the corner really nice, fold in the seam allowances and hold them between your thumb and index finger like that, and then just turn it. Hold it and then I use my nails to really force that into the corner. It gives you a much nicer corner than if you cut across it. Of course, there are some thicknesses of fabric where you just can't do that, where you actually need to cut across, where that makes sense. But in this case, because the lining is very light, there's no need to do that. Often you get like a little nose when you just cut across the fabric, and that's not so nice. Might need a pin to work it out a little more. I'm also putting a pin in to hold it in place until I iron it so it just doesn't slip out again and will look unsightly. That looks very nice. We're going to do one more snip to release tension in the seam. Imagine where the waistband would be. That's 3 centimeters up from the waistline. That's where we want to snip, not all the way. Here, that's not important. And then the seam allowances can lie on top of each other and you get a really nice straight up angle there where then it goes into the diagonal up. So that looks really, really nice. Cut that, but like I said, you don't have to cut right to the stitching line here. It's just to release it a bit so the layers can go on top of each other instead of against each other, pushing up and then creating an unsightly round and bulky area. Now we can press it. To press it, you want to move the seam into the edge. I do that by rolling the seam between my fingers and then pressing with a lot of heat and steam. This is denim, so you can go as hot as you like to give you that really pristine edge. There we go. Keep rolling it. See that there's a little dent in the top line as well. That makes the bib sit really nicely. A lot of patterns are straight across. This has this tiny little dip. It's actually really nice. It's all the little details, I think, that make this. I absolutely love this pattern. I make many patterns, but this I think is going to be one of my favorites. I've made so many of these and I still can't get enough of it. And that's usually the sign that, you know, you've done a good job when you like it yourself. There we go. Wonderful. Just having a good feel here and thinking, ooh, can I cut more back? So I do, and I cut the seam allowance to that point we just snipped and a little bit above it away, just to make sure there really isn't any seam allowance to interfere with my buttonhole. And there's a tiny little bit more that I can cut away. It's always a good thing to just feel it with your fingers and see where can I cut back a little bit more. And now we just have to pin the bib lining to the seam. And I'm using pins that stand vertical to the stitch line that we're going to do so that they're easy to pull out as I'm sewing. In theory, you can sew over these pins, but because we're having that massively heightened tension, what will happen is little loops will form around where the pin is inserted. So I would suggest that you don't do that and that you pull the pins out as you go along. Stitch length 4 again, hold on to the thread at the back and then pull it as you go. That makes it easier to get started, especially if you want to lock in your stitches. And here we go. All the way around. Make sure you always have the needle in the fabric when you turn. The distance here is 2 to 3 millimeters from the edge, as always when you work with denim fabrics. Heavy fabrics like a more structural look, so give the eye space by moving that first line slightly more in than you would do on a very lightweight fabric. Put the needle down, turn again. Lock in your stitches. And we've top stitched the bib. Now we still have to top stitch the waistline, so we're going to do that now. Force the fabric apart, make sure that it's nice and flat, and sew all the way across there. Again, the distance here is the same as everywhere else where we top stitch, so that it's even. Make sure that you remove the pins as you go along. Beautiful. Right, lock in your stitches. And next step. Awesome. It looks really good. Now we're going to put our full waistband stitching line on. We don't have a waistband because that would make it unnecessarily thick, but we do want that stitching line that the waistband would have because that completes the picture. It just doesn't look quite right without it. And there we go. All the way across. Stitch length 4, tension 11. The presser feet just go past the pocket. The bigger the size, the less of an issue it is, and I've designed it so that it wouldn't be an issue. This is the second smallest size, so of course it's quite close. Lock in your stitches. And we've got a beautiful front completed.
Looking pretty awesome, right? Now on to the next chapter, the not so easy buttonholes. See you there.